So, good evening everybody, and thank you for joining us. Obviously we've been here for the first panel. This second one is talking about what the independent regulators' key considerations are from financial, legal, governance and cultural perspectives. I'll explore what exactly that might mean as we go. Some of the questions that have already been asked might overlap with what we're going to discuss now, and will no doubt overlap with the third panel, but I don't think that's a big problem, and do keep your questions coming. I'll get to them as we go. But I come at this from a perspective. I've written a book, just £15 over there. Where's the money gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. And I'm a podcaster, do a podcast called Where's the Money Gone? And I've been a long time fan activist, was involved in the formation of the Football Supporters Association in the mid-80s and created the first national football fanzine in a magazine called Off the Ball, which predated even When Saturday Comes, which if nothing else tells you I'm very old. But the persistence of football's financial problems is real and ever present. It was one of the reasons why I started writing about football in the mid-80s. But even at the moment, we've got Sheffield Wednesday under a transfer embargo after failing to pay their players and falling into administration. Hull City at the moment can't pay any loan or transfer fees after making late payments on a previous transfer. Leicester City recently failed to honour a long-standing tradition of paying their non-playing staff their December wages before Christmas. So this is all part of the ongoing rumble of financial stress afflicting a game which, as we all know, just a few years ago saw Bury Football Club and the original Macclesfield Town go bust, and the likes of Derby County fall into administration. So I'm keen as a fan to hear how the IFR might prevent these kind of things from happening, a threat to the future of the club. I support West Bromwich Albion, actually provoked me to write the book because we were very close to the wind under our previous owners. There's also a chapter in the book about one of our West Midlands rivals, about Birmingham City, who for years were rumoured to be run from behind the scenes by a mystery man known as Mr. King, who was introduced to the manager at one point at Birmingham City. He was introduced to Harry Redknapp as the owner, and I followed the trail of Mr. King, a man called Wow Yahui, from China to Cambodia to the Cayman Islands, with the help of some very good journalists, a fan journalist called Daniel Ivory, Radio Free Asia, all of whom substantiated that Birmingham City were in fact having their strings pulled for a number of years by the man universally known as Mr. King, whose name, his real name, never appeared on a single document relating to the ownership of Birmingham City, and still hasn't been. I'm still awaiting my response from the EFL when I asked them about Mr. King. Can you tell us anything about the outcome of your investigation into this character known as Mr. King? I think I put my first query in 4 years ago. Maybe they'll get round to it sometime soon. So that's where I'm coming at it, from a fan, as a kind of an active participant in football, as a supporter and as a player as well. I'd be interested to hear from Miguel to start us off, because you've done work on sports washing and just talking about how football represents a kind of that sense of the cultural challenge that there is for a regulator. Because I'm talking about the finance and the ownership, but your work on sports washing, I think, points to something different and beyond, and it points to the question that we were asked there about ethical ownership. Who should own our football clubs? And if we collectively decide that it shouldn't be nation states or repressive nation states, how's the regulator?
Or even private equity funds. I mean, and this is actually, I suppose, a tension that the regulator is trying to reconcile. I mean, like, actually, I've done a book myself, didn't bring it sadly. But it's on.
There's only one on sale tonight.
Sports washing is on the cover, but it is actually about the political economy of football. And I do think there's actually a paradox in English football, because to go to almost any stadium on a weekend or a midweek night, it's packed. Like, the game is obviously thriving in terms of interest, and it also reflects how we have this immense cultural good. Arguably, I mean, so many of you will know, like, if you go to any town in England, the football club is almost the only cultural hub left that people rally around. And yet, on the other side, even some of the most obvious examples you've been speaking about the kind of financial issues, and just this immense stretch that's imposed on the game, coming from the very top, that is causing all sorts of financial issues, despite the amount of money flowing through the game. And also, there was a lot of emphasis in the last panel, I thought, on financial capital and investment. But I always find the madness of football is it generates so much money on its own, just because of this organic quality it's got of everyone being interested into it. So I think it's that tension, I suppose, between what is actually a cultural good and the business element of the game, which the regulator is trying to reconcile. I'm glad it exists. It's got many good virtues, not least, I think, finally recognising the heritage aspect of football. I think both implicitly and in some cases explicitly recognising its cultural value. Its statutory powers are key. I think the one about rogue owners is actually key, but obviously we have to see how it actually works in practice, as well as how many challenges are going to be thrown up, which we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, indeed, and we'll throw some of these at David Riley in a minute, who is the General Counsel for the Independent Football Regulator. He's the sponge who's going to soak all this up. But let's bring in Patrick Davies. Patrick is Head of UK Corporate Secretarial Services at Law Debenture. They put forward a very interesting paper with LCP, which I read and featured on the podcast, talking about what bar we can set for the regulator, how ambitious we should be for making demands upon the regulator.
Yes, certainly. So thanks very much, Adrian. So I think the Football Governance Act, the Independent Football Regulator, is going to implement an licensing regime, which is a fantastic opportunity to create a sustainable approach to football governance generally. Licensed clubs will, through an annual compliance statements, have to evidence their meeting of obligations likely to be around, I'm looking to David, likely to be around business plans, strategy, accountability, identification and management of risks, succession, training and skills, EDI and fan community engagement. So properly implemented, these principles can contribute to a long-term sort of company performance by building an environment of trust, transparency and accountability. But the challenge for the IFR, obviously, is going to be the prevailing governance culture within the football pyramid. Clearly there's accountability on the pitch, but there is very limited sort of insight into boardroom processes, with some notable exceptions. So the challenge that I've talked about there is backed up by research that was published in the summer in our joint LCP Law Dev piece around football governance in transition. So the data drawn from Companies House relating to the 116 clubs in the football pyramid highlighted aspects of board composition which will naturally affect governance approaches, which lacked imagination really. Over 15% of those 116 clubs had less than 3 board directors, including at that stage Sheffield Wednesday. Across the whole of those boards, that's 116 clubs, only 8% of directors were females. Contrast that with the FTSE 100 boardrooms in early 2025, where 45% of directors were female. So then behind those statistics, we've also got the challenge of unique ownership structures, with owners who invested on a large scale into a football club, bringing a certain amount of entitlement in relation to the way in which it's run. I mean, David Cogan has made clear that the IFR is not going to tell a football club how to run its club. Also, the IFR has stressed that it will be taking a principles-based proportionate approach to its role. The apply or explain compliance requirement that clubs are going to have to go through will further allow clubs to provide explanations and mitigations for not meeting relevant FGA obligations. But nonetheless, there are unavoidably obligations that the IFR have to discharge. It will have to review governance arrangements across a diverse range of clubs, establish consistency and standards, and provide guidance relating to improvements. There's a large amount of work to be undertaken and a lot of new regulatory relationships to be forged. David Cogan's indication that each club will have a personal handler at the IFR is consistent with an expectation that IFR club relationships will be key and the determinant of the IFR's success. In an alternative scenario, imagine an exercise of the IFR's power where they've imposed a discretionary licence condition which is resisted or challenged or goes to judicial review. That runs the risk of undermining the IFR's remit and its credibility, I think. So returning to our recommendations over the summer, a minimum 3-director board requirement, expectations around greater diversity within the boardroom, and mandatory training in relation to director duties and the football industry. They are examples of potentially good minimums for a practical governance framework. And further, if the IFR is successful in creating an accepted approach to governance among licensed clubs that encourages accountability and evidences stakeholder engagement, then from my perspective, I think that will be a great foundation to build on.
Right, so thank you. You mentioned judicial review. Let me read Nick DeMarco from Blackstone Chambers, and as we were hearing that from Patrick there, I was thinking about Manchester City taking the Premier League to court. I'm not going to ask you to comment on this particular case, but here is a fact that Manchester City took the Premier League to court, and the case ended up in court, because they questioned the Premier League's very right to impose related party rules upon them, to have related party rules in the first place. And we never heard what the outcome of that was, the ruling, other than to say, ultimately, perhaps begrudgingly, Manchester City accepted that the Premier League had the right to have related party rules. So now we've got an IFR in place, do you expect as a lawyer to get a lot more work out of the football industry?
Well, I think there will be more work and different work, because we see a different landscape. I mean, one of the interesting things is that there are a number of broad new powers, some might even say draconian powers, that the regulator has, but it's got a quite narrow remit. I think we need to remember that it's not going to do everything.
So what are those draconian powers?
Well, search warrants, for example. You don't have the Premier League, even the Premier League, however pushy they can be, having the powers to break into somebody's house and seize documents, and criminal sanctions if documents are not provided when they're requested. I mean, you have these state powers. It's important when you look at something like the owners and directors test, for example. One of the things that I've dealt with before when dealing with these is, you might have information from a foreign state about a potential foreign owner. But how reliable that information is, you don't know. The FA or the Football League almost certainly don't know. In this case, you would no doubt have access to intelligence, British intelligence, foreign intelligence, about the activities of foreign owners. So the fact that you have these state powers, the state regulation behind the powers, is extraordinarily important. And that's why the powers can be draconian. But of course it also means the other side of that is that those powers will need to be exercised in a far more transparent and proportionate way than the powers that have previously been exercised by the Premier League or the Football League, often behind closed doors. How many people in this room know actually how the owners and directors tests are applied by the Football League or the Premier League? It's all behind closed doors. It's all a nudge and a wink. It's all, I'm not going to say who you know, I'm not going to go that far, but there has been an element of that. You can't have that with the statutory regulator. And the decisions it makes, not only the decisions it makes, the decisions it fails to make will be subject to challenge in the courts, in open courts, public courts, judicial review principles, in front of proper judges, with proper disclosure, the kind of scrutiny that you simply have not had in sports litigation for the past 25, 30 years, where we've had everything behind closed doors and in arbitration. That changes the entire legal landscape, not only because of some owner challenging his or her application to take over a club, but fans groups will, in my view and a lot of my colleagues, have standing to bring challenges to decisions or failure or to make decisions where they are concerned parties of the regulator. So you're going to have a lot more of that kind of activity in my view.
Let's throw it over then to our man from the regulator, to David Riley. Yes, Tom, when it's green, I think. So there's a big basket of things there. Do you want to address it broadly?
Not much to come back on. let me just pull out a few key considerations from our perspective. Perhaps the first one is a bigger picture one, which Bill touched upon at the start, which is this first period for us is all about establishing ourselves as a credible regulator at pace, which is no mean feat. Across the last 3 months since legal establishment, we've published 5 consultations, which is pretty much breaking new ground for a statutory regulator. We've accelerated our powers with DCMS to be able to look at incumbent owners and officers and their suitability. We published final rules and guidance on that regime, on investigation, sanctions, enforcement. So we've done a lot. For the next 6 months, we've equally got a great deal to do. So tomorrow we'll publish our terms of reference for the IFR State of the Game report. Next year we'll be taking, at the end of the year, we'll be taking applications for club licenses. Middle of the year, our new powers will go online for new owners and officers. And in March, we'll consult a second consultation on a licensing regime, which will cover corporate governance, fan engagement, and financial resources. So there's loads to be done, but I think in this first period, what we've really been conscious of is A, trying to get the message out there as to what we are doing, rather than, as we said on the first panel, what we're not doing, what people might expect us to do, and just demonstrating that we are here, ready and willing to act at pace. I think we've done a really credible job of that so far. I think the next consideration from us, thinking about club finances, which has been touched upon a lot, is just making sure we're an organisation which takes decisions based on a proper evidence base. And so we've been going out to clubs, to leagues, to competition owners and others to try to start building that, but now we're formally gathering evidence to feed into the State of the Game report, which we have to produce within the first 18 months of the regime. And that will cover a host of things, and a number of things that Bill again said in the first panel, which was things that we want to avoid happening as well. We want to avoid dampening investment. We want to avoid having an unnecessary impact on competition between clubs. And so what the State of the Game report aims to do is delve into the finances of football across the period in more detail than has ever been done before. So we'll be looking at club debt, club income, we'll be looking at the owner funding, the role of debt across the football pyramid, we'll be looking at the market for players, we'll be looking at club resilience to macroeconomic shocks, all these things, and then there's corporate governance and fan engagement. So there's a lot to do, but there's a lot of stuff that we need to gather to start taking those decisions, and that sort of evidence-based decision making will carry on as we work through the regime. So when we're making determinations in relation to incoming owners and officers, that's based on their business plan, their costings of the club, how they're going to fund it. When we're looking at licensing, stepping in relation to whether a club has sufficient financial resources, that's based on a fundamental understanding of the club's business model. They vary hugely between clubs. The club's reliance on debt, the club's liquidity, all these types of things, and building a risk picture. All of this is essential to make sure that we can engage and intervene effectively, proportionately, and only where necessary as well. So the evidence base is going to be crucial to us going forward, and it's going to be absolutely crucial to one of Nick's points, which is making sure we can defend our decisions. This isn't an arbitrary regime. This is a regime where decisions are taken based on the evidence that's been gathered. And then the final point I make is a cultural one, which is a lot has been said on how is a statutory regulator really going to land with football? Is that not just a complete mismatch of cultures? I mean, the first point to make is that football has had regulation for many, many years. It's just been regulation by contract rather than regulation by statute. The two are not a million miles apart. And we've been out there making 2 points on culture, which is first, this isn't an enforcement-led regime. So we talked before about reaching for lawyers. I mean, you can reach for lawyers without it being a fine at the end of it. You can reach for lawyers for proportionate interventions and cooperation, I can assure you. And so this regime, it's all about having supervisors which engage with clubs on a daily, weekly basis. It's about engaging with lower league clubs, those with fewer resources, to make sure they understand the obligations and requirements on them, and helping them to understand that, really explain it to them. And then the final point on culture, I guess, is just to say that we've been taking real steps to understand the differences between clubs. So we've got 116 clubs. They vary hugely in their business model, their funding, their access to resources. So some clubs will look at this regime and they'll say, great, we've already got 4 people that can provide the IFR with the information that it needs. Other clubs lower down the pyramid will say, God, this looks expensive, it looks difficult to comply with, how are we going to do it? And look, we get that, which is why we want to cooperate with those clubs. We've already had someone go around to all National League clubs. We've had a dedicated resource working with the National League and very much set the tone of that cooperative, I'll try that again, a approach going forward.
Okay, that's fair and comprehensive. Right from that, Miguel, anything, from your work that it doesn't sound like, does it, that the regulator's going to be taking any intervention, for example, on state ownership of football clubs?
No, and obviously that was one of the amendments suggested, although, the rogue ownership one is, I think, or the power to force rogue owners to divest, I think is a very badly needed. I mean, look, you only have to look at Sheffield Wednesday for the ultimate example of that, and how the EFL, the only way they can punish the club is basically through administration, which is too late. There is an interesting question about that, and I suppose it touches on a lot of the tensions the regulator has to put across. In some ways, how can you actually regulate a game? You mentioned states a lot, but how can you actually regulate a game if there are powers involved that are just have a power beyond any of this? They can go to kind of diplomatic levels, can cause all sorts of interference. That's not an argument against the regulator, even though obviously that sort of thing has been pushed around the Premier League. But I suppose you're going to have potentially a core tension with this, which is, well, if Manchester City are found guilty of the most serious charges, is that grounds for divestment? Is that a rogue owner? I actually asked ECMS this before and they couldn't answer it.
Let's say something about the Sheffield Wednesday thing.
Yes.
I was acting for Sheffield Wednesday very recently, and unfortunately also for Derby County when they went into administration. And I think the problem is, what do you do in those circumstances? The owner, however controversial he is, and I may be controversial saying this, however controversial he was, put in lots of money to Sheffield Wednesday until he didn't have any more money to put in. And so what do? You can't just strip the club from him. You have to actually get someone else to own the club and put the money in. And it seems to me the biggest problem in the past hasn't been a failure to remove rogue owners or whatever, but it's a failure to create a circumstance that makes it easier for new owners to come in and invest. And I think that one of the problems here is that what you'd have, and I saw this with Derby County, for example, when they were in administration, you have so many tyre kickers, as we call them, who want to go on social media and say we're going to buy a football club, and they never actually have the money, and you spend months locked into agreements with them, and then they go away. Whereas if the Football League, and now hopefully I think the regulator will do this, says actually if you want to buy a club, you have to have a license, you have to already be vetted. We can say you are a bona fide potential purchaser. It doesn't waste that time, and you can make that transformation much more quickly, which will help the clubs.
Yeah. And sorry, just so I understand that correctly, then can people apply to be EFL or Premier League or National League owners sort of a priori, get a stamp of authority from you to say they are a suitable owner, and then engage with potentially buying a club?
Yeah, look, there's a balance to be found here, and other regulators have this as well, like the CMA. What we don't want is a host of people coming to us and saying, can you just check I'm okay to buy a club? Because we'll have everyone coming just to check they're fine. So we're going to do what most regulators do, is we will encourage applications when there is a credible deal on the table, whether that's a period of exclusivity or whether that's because the club is on board. So yeah, it's not going to be a free-for-all, but it is ex ante, so no one can take control of a club or take up an offer of employment as a senior executive prior to coming to the IFR and seeking approval from us.
It's not a bit of a fundamental issue here, especially when we're talking about cultural value and fans and the sake of fans, where when one of these situations happens, it's basically almost put out to this public auction. And as you mentioned, all sorts of channels get involved, often who knows where they're coming from or the background. But and let's not forget as well, so much of this stemmed from, as you say, as the previous panel said, the aftermath of the Super League. When we had Boris Johnson, of all people, talking about the German model, should the regulator not be starting to investigate a pathway to some sort of fan ownership? I know it goes some of the way towards that with some of the heritage aspects, but should it not be actually beginning to explore the idea of putting clubs in the hands of the people who are actually the custodians, the fan base?
So a couple of points. In terms of putting clubs in the hand of anyone, that's not within our remit. So we get to look at owners that are currently in place. If a new owner comes in, irrespective of business model, we'll look at that to see whether we approve them. And the things that we'll consider are the honesty and integrity of the person coming in, their financial soundness, whether they've got sufficient financial resources, whether they've got any connections and criminal source of funds. So the test, it's not a free-for-all. It's a very, as Nick said, it's a very tightly defined test. with a number of criteria we can take into account. And interestingly, for a piece of legislation, explicitly says if it's not in the statute, we've not set out in rules, we can't take it into account. So that's the first point. On the ownership models, look, at this point in time, we are agnostic as to ownership models, and that's one of the things we're going to be looking at in the state of the game. So we're going to look at the different models across the game, the different problems that they solve, the different problems that they create, and over time, yeah, we might have a view as to which types of ownership models are more effective for ensuring club financial soundness. But what that model is, we'll we see at the time.
But you're not saying it's not just about club financial soundness. We are talking about the game's financial soundness as well.
Absolutely.
And as soon as you have a certain type of owner that puts stresses on that, then it kind of causes ripples through the whole system that start to, no matter how well intentioned the system, cause to come apart.
You want to come back?
Yeah.
Look, we've got three objectives. Two of them are financially focused. One is financial soundness of individual clubs. Another is the financial resilience of the pyramids. Yeah, we are looking at all the anything. We talk about macro shocks. We talk about the broadcasting market. All these things that might affect more than one club. We are looking at as part of the.
Well, the point being that the specific identity of an owner, you're looking at that in terms of financial soundness, whereas specific owners will actually have a wider effect on the pyramid. I mean, City is the classic case. Same with Chelsea, but clearly.
Yeah, no, I mean, it depends what effect you mean. I mean, ultimately, people are putting money into their clubs and others are putting money in response to that. We need to understand whether that is something that we're concerned about. So in reality, we're concerned about the financial soundness of individual clubs. There are certain things going down the pyramid. You talk about cliff edges, we talk about distributions. There are various things which have positive impacts on the game and might have different impacts on the game. So in terms of what they create, and that's the sort of stuff that we are looking at. But in terms of the impact of one individual owner as creating a systemic risk in the game, I don't read that naturally into the statute.
Okay, but so behind what you've just said, just to make, I think what you're saying explicit, is that the financial instability of football is a feature, it's not a bug. And I would argue that that instability is created by the creation of the Premier League itself, the cliff edge that it creates financially between the Premier League and the rest of English football, but one which is magnified by the existence of parachute payments, which are great for the Premier League because they ensure that, if people don't know, they ensure that clubs who are in the Premier League, who don't have huge resources, can afford to spend big when they're in the Premier League, because it's kind of an insurance policy that even if you go down, you've got 3 years of money coming from the Premier League to protect you. So that's why the Premier League loves parachute payments. But the Championship, particularly, and below, hate parachute payments because they distort competition within the Championship and then encourage this ridiculous financial scramble whereby clubs like Preston North End, for example, merely to exist in the middle of the Championship, have to lose £10 million every year. So is that kind of structural issue going to be within your remit, and will you have the power and will you be willing, should you come to this conclusion, the same conclusion I've just outlined, to tell the Premier League you're going to have to distribute more of your money in a particular way and not deal in parachute payments or reduce parachute payments?
Yeah, no, as you say, that is your view, and different. Many people share your view, many people don't share your view, but there are all sorts of different views. And distributions is going to be one of the fundamental parts of State of the Game. That will be the terms of reference that's published tomorrow. Our role in distributions at this point in time is that we don't have a role. So the leagues can come to their own agreement on distributions, as they have always been able to do. What the legislation does.
They don't currently have an agreement though, do they?
Well, there is money flowing down. They don't have a new agreement, but there is agreement in place. But what we are able to do is, if that hasn't been done and someone asks us to trigger what's called a backstop mechanism, sort of colloquially, we can at that point step in. If we agree to trigger the backstop, there's a mediation process, and ultimately, and this is one of our sort of powers that is very contingent on things happening first, step in with a distribution order which does exactly what you just described, which sets out our view as to how football should be distributed, money should be distributed, and put something in place. Now, as Nick said, that is a fairly draconian power in some ways because it goes to property rights, and so there are rights to appeal. There'll be a long process where we gather evidence and take everyone's views on board, but ultimately that power is there if the deal doesn't get done.
Would you fancy defending the Premier League's corner if the regulator said you've got to change the method of parachute payments?
whoever instructs me.
It might be us, yes.
That's our professional obligation.
Well, would you
I-
feel you're on good legal ground? Would you feel you had a good strong case to push back?
I mean, I think I agree with Dave. I don't think we will get to that stage. I think that stick is there in order to encourage some kind of settlement and negotiation between the leagues, which I think will ultimately occur. In the past, there have been, and there are agreements in place between the leagues about distribution, but it's a kind of agreement. It's like, you know, I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. The Premier League come along and say, do this, do that, and we'll give you this money, or don't do this, don't do that, and you won't get the money. You look at the financial fair play rules, the PSR rules, they're effectively forced on the Football League by the Premier League, as are the parachute payments and so on. So I think the landscape will change because of the ultimate powers there. They will encourage the Premier League to have to negotiate more and take into account more the interests of other clubs. But it's not going to solve the problems. And ultimately, my own view has always been that you can't entirely solve these problems unless you have a sort of American model and you have wage caps and you get rid of relegation and promotion and you say clubs can only spend this much money and it's all got to be equal. I mean, you can have that model if you like, but I don't think we want that model in Europe. We don't want that model in the UK. We like promotion and relegation. We like jeopardy. We like the risk that is involved. And that means that club owners ought to be allowed to invest money for success and compete with established clubs. Otherwise, you'll always have the established clubs there, and no one can ever challenge them.
But should football really be dictated by how wealthy your owner is? Surely the issue is actually revenue distribution rather than investments.
But the problem is that if you have the examples you gave, Chelsea and Manchester. I mean, I remember when Manchester City was in Division 2, when Chelsea was no bigger than the club I support, QPR. I remember those days. They now generate massive revenue, but it was owner investment that got them to the position to do that.
But the same token, it's not that long ago. City were champions 68, Chelsea 55. And what was that consequence of? That's a consequence actually of a highly regulated game. And one of the first moves in English football was actually a revenue distribution move. It was about sharing matches and gate receipts. And obviously, the lesson of the last 40 years has been the erosion of all of that to create this situation where, and this one Super League came out of, about 12 super clubs, so much more powerful than the rest. So surely what the game is actually tackling, it's not this this lottery in terms of who invests in you, but actually where the existing money goes.
Well, you know, I think that is a good argument, but I don't think it's what the regulators
No, I mean,
even interested in or going to do. But I think it's certainly a good argument. But I think to try and have a slightly more micro approach at the moment. My own view is that one of the real problems with the regulator, and it's not its fault, it's a political issue and it's its remit, is that its key, as David has said, its key objective is to look at financial sustainability. But the rules about financial sustainability made by the Premier League and the Football League are entirely independent of and operate separately from the regulator's powers and have different powers and objectives, and it means you have two different levels of regulation which may be pointing in different directions at certain points, and I think that is a problem, not of the regulators making, but of the political compromise that has been made about who has which powers.
Okay, well let people ponder that. I want to ask a question which came in from Henry Tapper, and I'm going to ask this of you, Patrick, because you've done this deep dive into the state of football. Very simple question. When our football is so good, why are so many clubs going bust?
Well, I think there are issues around governance which do inform the way in which clubs go bust, and I think that a lack of an accountable sort of clear strategy within clubs, a lack of an ability to engage with different stakeholders, a lack of understanding, a lack of transparency in decision making and strategy, they're the sort of situations which leads to clubs going bust. We see it from the outside at the moment because these decisions are made behind closed doors. But there is invariably, when you're looking as a fan at your club's decisions around transfer spending, around different sort of deployments of managers or different approaches to the game, you wonder where the strategy is behind that. And so the hope is, with a governance regime which encourages that accessibility, that transparency, that accountability, we might get to a stage where fans can have a reasonable expectation that clubs are articulating a direction that they can engage with. And hopefully, it's not going to guarantee success, but it's going to give a bit of transparency, a bit of understanding to fans who are on the receiving end often and unable really to make a logical sort of deduction as to why their club is going in a particular direction. I say that as a West Ham fan.
David, let me bring together the threads of that conversation there between Miguel and Mick, because there's this kind of Nick, sorry, there is this kind of dichotomy posed between the NFL style model, the kind of franchise model of football, or our current kind of laissez-faire promotion and relegation. But there was a time, and again, I'd say this maybe with too much misty-eyed nostalgia, when English football, albeit with its kind of laissez-faire ownership model and under the rules that then applied, permitted clubs like mine, West Bromwich Albion, like Ipswich Town, to Watford, to start a season thinking they might be champions of England. That is an impossible thing now, other than in your wildest dreams, and that's coming out because of the financial distribution within football and the financial muscle that some clubs have been able to leverage. Is it any part of the regulator's role, as you see it, to challenge that?
Look, one of our secondary duties is to make sure we don't have a detrimental impact on competition between clubs, but really our objectives around financial resilience and around the soundness of individual clubs are about ensuring that individual clubs are financially sound. Things like competitive balance have historically and continue to be the preserve of the leagues and how they deal that within their rules. So indirectly we might be concerned with some of these things. So indirectly we're concerned with distributions, and I completely agree with the point that was made on the first panel, which is, look, distributions in and of itself, sending more money down raises the question as to, well, what is going to be done with that money? Can you just send money down and expect that to help? Well, in reality, perhaps not. And that's why the IFR's powers work in combination. So there's distributions going down the pyramid now. There are concerns that in some instances they might not be spent as effectively as they can. A licensing regime gives us the powers to make sure that clubs are spending that wisely and giving themselves a full sense of their own risk. So no, we're not there to rebalance the pyramid competitively, but we are there to make sure that clubs still in the pyramid are well run.
And Adrian, if I can just argue a different point there, that I don't think it's just distribution that stops other clubs being able to compete. It is the existing profit and sustainability rules and the SCR rules that will replace them. That is part of the problem. And if you look at
Which
just
again, sorry,
recent,
just in case people don't understand that, the idea being that you can only spend
what you
70%
earn,
of what you
or
earn.
70%, or a certain,
Which some people say it's the big clubs kind of pulling up the ladder.
and you look at an example, sorry to take clubs, but you just look at an example of a couple of years ago. Nottingham Forest, I acted for them in their PSR case. They broke the rules. They got a 4-point deduction. They spent a lot of money. They invested a lot of money. Okay, they're now currently not in the best position, but they ended that season very well, and they have taken the club onto a new level, as have Aston Villa. Luton Town complied with the rules, didn't spend too much money, and were relegated. Which would you prefer if you were a football fan?
But sure, the flip side of that is, and the reason we have the rules, because of the chaos that football was in the mid-2000s. We don't have guarantees that owners like Marinakis or whoever will stay. And so that the rules that are in are to protect clubs from themselves,
That's
for owners.
yes.
Which is why we return to the issue of where the money goes rather than investments.
That's why a lot of us think some kind of guarantees or bonds that owners are required to put in is a better solution than simply preventing investment.
Interesting point. Okay, did you want to have a final thought?
Not really. I mean,
No.
I think we, my colleagues have sort of covered the ground very well.
No, listen, I feel very honoured. Thank you so much, David. It's been great to have your, I mean, it's great to have all three of you, but to have David's comments as, you know, as the voice of the regulator, that's been really instructive and enlightening. So thank you. Thank you to Patrick, thank you to Miguel, and thank you to Nick. I've really valued this chat. Thanks very much. Cheers.
I'd like to say thank you to Adrian for chairing that panel so well, and all the panellists for contributing, particularly for David for doing the regulator viewpoint. Fascinating, and I'm sure we could go on for much longer. But we need to crack on, so we're going to have a slightly longer break now, a comfort break. So if everyone could be back here by 6:55, I think.